So good to be true. And I will tell you, I actually told some people this earlier this morning. This is a series that when we were planning out the year and planning out the teaching calendar for the year, this was a series that I'll just be honest with you, I kind of wrestled with a little bit because I felt a couple of things. One, I felt a heaviness and a weightiness around it. And also I felt this sense of like, hey, this may not actually be as relevant as I hope it would be. And then the more I wrestle with it, the more I realize, no, I think this is relevant for every single one of us, regardless of where we are in our faith journey and regardless of where we are in life. And I'll tell you, in this series, So Good to Be True, we're going to take a deep dive over the next 5 weeks into the life and in the teachings of one man. And you're going to be shocked by who this is, being by the fact that you're sitting in church, right? We're going to spend the next 5 weeks just diving into the life and the teachings and the events specifically around the person of Jesus. Now, when we talk about Jesus, I'll just kind of say this. There's a lot of opinions about Jesus in our world, right? Even in this room, there are a lot of opinions about Jesus, who he is, what he did, what he didn't do, what's true, what's not true. There's a lot of perspectives around that, a lot of opinions around that. But we'll just kind of start by saying this. There's much agreement about at least 2 things about the person of Jesus. In fact, if you study like historians throughout the ages, if you look at scholarly material over the years, right, you're going to find massive agreement around at least 2 things about Jesus that to you might seem basic, but I think it's important that we start by just recognizing these things. The first, that you're going to find massive agreement that Jesus was a historical figure, right? Like nobody really debates that. Everybody believes that from around the year 4 BC to around 30 AD, Jesus lived a physical life, historically, right? We have records of this, right? In fact, ancient Roman historians captured moments from his life and referenced him. Josephus, who many of you might recall from like your, college history class or your world history class in high school, right? Josephus references the person of Jesus. Tacitus, another Roman historian, very well trusted, very credible source, references the person of Jesus. Hardly anyone disagrees with the idea that Jesus is a historical figure. And the second thing that almost everybody has massive agreement around, even in this room, we probably find massive agreement around this, regardless of what you believe about Jesus or what you believe about faith, massive agreement about the idea that Jesus was indeed a great teacher. In fact, Josephus references Jesus, and he says that Jesus' teachings themselves were so amazing that he won over many of the Jews and many of the Greeks. So we have this diverse population of people all responding to the great teachings of Jesus in this historical moment and during his life. We have teachings like the Golden Rule that many of us are still familiar with today, and Rob referenced just a few minutes ago, right? Like everyone almost across the board agrees that Jesus was a great teacher. Now, when we say that, we'll also just kind of acknowledge that Jesus wasn't the first great teacher to hit and kind of engage with our world. In fact, there were a number of great teachers that had come shortly before Jesus. In fact, just prior to Jesus, we had great teachers like Socrates, who many of you are familiar with. We had Plato, Aristotle, even Confucius, right? Great teachers who actually all had a head start on Jesus, who all introduced their teachings before the person of Jesus. And the teachers who you're familiar with today, and at the same time, I think we can just acknowledge that no one's teachings have permeated our world and our culture more than the teachings of Jesus. In fact, I just kind of say this, like no one grew up singing, "Confucius loves me, this I know." You know what I mean? Like nobody says that. I've never seen anybody in a moment of big decision ask themselves, let me look at my bracelet, what would Plato do? And then nobody in the middle of the night when they stub their toe, nobody yells out, Socrates! No, like in some way, shape, or form, for some reason or other, right? The teachings of Jesus have permeated our culture in a way that no other great teachers' teachings have. Now, I'll tell you this, the earliest followers of Jesus, they weren't surprised by this, and if they came back today and saw our world today, they wouldn't be surprised by this either, because even in their time, even in real time, watching and receiving the teachings of Jesus, they recognized that there was something different about this man. In fact, the earliest followers of Jesus believed just at their core, and you can read their writings and find this, at their core, they just genuinely believed and insisted that Jesus himself was good news for all people at all times. That Jesus, even when they were receiving his teachings, and even in just a few years after receiving his teachings, they recognized that Jesus was good news, not just for them, but for everyone, and not just for their time, but for all times and all places and all cultures and all spaces. Now, what's interesting about this is if you study the teachings of Jesus, like really truly study the teachings of Jesus, what you actually begin to find is that many of Jesus' teachings, at first glance, don't actually feel like good news. In fact, in many ways, its teachings at first glance, many of them actually feel like what I would consider almost like bad news. for many of us. Now, to kind of understand that, we got to understand that most teachers in this day were teaching around a variety of subjects, but one of the subjects that they often taught about was around the subject or the topic of morality, right? Like just this understanding of what's right and what's wrong, right? And like every great teacher has teachings about morality, and Jesus comes in and introduces teachings about morality, and these teachings of morality really just kind of like give us an understanding of what's good, what's bad, what's right, what's wrong. We might even just say like these are teachings that kind of help us understand where the bar is, you know? And many of us ask ourselves in moments of decision, like, hey, where's the line? Where's the bar? What do I need to do to be good enough in this moment or to be good in this situation or to kind of do the right thing in this situation? What's right in this moment? What's pure? What's good in this moment? And most teachers, right, provided some level of teaching around morality that kind of defined where the bar is. And then many times you would find teachers who are introducing some type of religious structure to help people navigate these moments when they don't quite live up to the bar, right? In fact, most religious structures, if you look at them, if you look at Judaism, if you look at Islam, most of the major religions of our world, you look at these religious structures and they actually inform people with the steps that they can take when they actually live below the bar to actually find themselves back in a place where they're good and in right standing with their fellow man and with their Creator. And Jesus actually steps in to this kind of environment, this kind of framework. He actually steps into Judaism as a teacher within the Jewish faith. And he begins to teach on morality. He begins to teach on where the bar is. Now, for some of us, based on the picture that you've kind of been given of Jesus at some point in your life, you would kind of expect Jesus in this moment to start to either do one of these two things, right? To either lower the bar of morality or to even just to remove it altogether. But Jesus does something massively different in this moment that, quite honestly, at first glance, doesn't feel like good news to me at all. Jesus actually begins in his teachings to raise the bar on morality, to raise the line for us and for how we might ought to live. In fact, look at his earliest teaching, the first teaching that he gave to a large group of people who were his followers. He gathered them all along on the side of a mountain. He began to talk to them about his way of living and his rules for living or his sense of morality in the world. And he said things like this. He said to them, you have heard it said to those of old. So you've heard it said in the past that you shall not murder, one of the 10 commandments. Makes sense, right? He says, whoever murders will be liable to judgment. That makes sense. Good rule, right? Good bar, good line. Hey, don't murder, right? I get that. He goes, but I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. And I just look at that and I go, well, murder, sure, I get it, but angry, I get angry all the time. What are you talking about, Jesus? Like, I can't live up to a line like that. He goes on, he says, you've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. Makes sense. Good. I like that rule. Makes sense. Kind of resonates, right? He goes, but I say to you that everyone who even looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. You go, whoa, what do you mean, Jesus? Like, Jesus, like, what if she just walks in front of me? You know, like, what am I supposed to do? Jesus, what if she just slides into my DMs? Like, how am I supposed to help it in that moment? You know, like, but Jesus is like, no, but the line was here, but now the line is here. He says, again, you've heard it said, to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but you shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. So that's what they had been told before. Hey, don't swear falsely. Like if you swear by something or if you make an oath by something, make sure you live up to it. He says, but I say to you, do not take an oath at all. Let what you say be simply yes or no. When I was growing up, my sister and I growing up, we had this kind of like unwritten rule in our family, or particularly just between us, my sister and I, and our relationship. It was basically this: you can't break a pinky promise. Like if you say something and you pinky promise to it, like you can't be lying in that moment. Which kind of subtly said, like, hey, if you say something casually, like on the way to school or over dinner or whatever, and then you change your mind later and you want to take it back, or like, hey, you kind of like tell a lie, we could tell a lie to each other, and like it's okay. But like a pinky promise, like no, we can't break a pinky promise. You know what I mean? And Jesus basically said, hey, no more pinky promises. Just let your yes be yes, let your no be no. Just say what you mean to say and stick to your word in that moment. And what you find when you say Jesus is that he continuously raises the bar. Now, to be honest with you, many of us, if you're familiar with Jesus, many of us like to think of Jesus, the teacher, as kind of like the high school football coach who also teaches social studies. You know, like not really a lot of rules. There's not going to be any tests. Like, don't give me any trouble and everything's going to be okay. And yet Jesus, when he enters the world and begins his first round of teaching, he comes in like that college professor who's just trying to ruin your semester. and just continuously raising the bar over and over and over again. Now, anytime that you and I experience a high bar of morality, quite honestly, we respond with one of two emotions. There's probably a variety of these. We could bucket them all down to one of two emotions. The first thing that some of us feel in moments of high bars in our lives is we actually feel pride. Because maybe it's an area of our life where we can actually live above the bar. And we feel really good about that. In fact, some of us had grew up in religious structures with people who were really proud of the fact that they lived above the bar, at least in some areas of their lives. And some of us today even feel that a little bit. Like you look at pieces of your life, you look at your marriage, or you look at your finances, or you look at the way that you give, or you look at the things that you do for other people, you look at the good that you're doing in the world, you look at the kindness and the grace that you showed somebody else, and you're proud of the fact that you could live above the bar in that moment of your life, or that area of your life. Others of us find ourselves looking at the bar. And we look at high bars of morality in our life, high lines, and the experience, or the emotion that we feel isn't pride necessarily. What we actually feel in some of those moments is shame. We actually look at that and we go, oh, like I fall so far below that. And we feel like we could never, ever live up to that. We actually feel shame for the moments where we fell short. Shame for the moments where we didn't show up for somebody else. Shame for the moments where our actions actually hurt someone else. Shame for the moments where our decisions actually hurt ourselves. No, Jesus actually told a story about two different types of people and their relationship with morality, and the ways that they respond and the ways that they felt around morality, and the way that they actually experienced these two emotions themselves. The story he told went like this. He said, 2 men went up into the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee, and the other a tax collector. Now, to understand this story, we got to understand these characters. The Pharisees in the times of Jesus were basically, I might say, just professional rule followers. I mean, these were the people who were the best at living up to the bar, living up to the highest of standards. They checked all of the boxes. They followed all of the Jewish laws. They did everything just the right way. Tax collectors, on the other hand, still Jewish people, but far different from Pharisees. Tax collectors were known as some of the worst people within society and some of the biggest wrongdoers within society. In fact, tax collectors had actually made an agreement with the Roman Empire to be representatives of Rome as Jews to the Jewish people for the sake of collecting the heavy taxes from the Jewish people to send it back to the Roman Empire. And they often or always got paid based on their cut of the taxes they would take. And they'd often extort more taxes from people for the sake of their own gain and the sake of their own wealth. Tax collectors weren't just the worst of the worst. They were actually selling out God's people to the Roman Empire for the sake of their own gain. And Jesus tells a story very quickly, puts these two characters in juxtaposition to each other and says they both go up to the temple to pray. And he says the Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus. He said, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. Can you imagine being the tax collector in this story, He says, I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. I follow all of the rules. I do all of the right things. I live my life right here all of the time. He goes on, he says, but the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven. Proverbially speaking, he can't even look God in the eye. He says, but he beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Now, let me ask you a question and also tell you the answer to the question, because quite honestly, the answer for me is the answer for you, and it's the answer for every person who has ever lived and ever engaged in this conversation. Are you the Pharisee? Or are you the tax collector? And the answer, quite honestly, is it depends. It just depends on which area of life we're talking about. For some of us, you look at your marriage and you go, man, I'm doing so good. I'm living above the bar. I've never cheated. I've never thought about cheating. I've never walked out. I'm almost always kind. Right? But if we were to look at the way that you operate at work and the way that you engage with the relationships with coworkers, you look at that and ooh, I feel shame and guilt around that for sure. Others of us, we say, oh, no. We look at our finances. We say, oh, I'm so above the bar. Like, I give so much money away. When someone asks me for something, I give it to them, and we feel such pride around that. And at the same time, we also, if we look at our time, we go, oh, we constantly find ourselves saying, I need to give more time away and do more for others. Or we even remember moments in our life where someone in our life needed something from us, and they didn't need money. We couldn't pay our way through it. What they needed was us, and we withheld us from them in that moment. I was thinking this week, for some reason or other, I was reminded this week of a moment in my life where I found myself kind of processing a decision, and it's about 10 years, probably about 15 years ago. I knew what the right decision was, but I also just didn't want to make it, quite honestly. And I actually remember laying in bed one night, and I was praying, this is honest to God, a prayer I prayed in my college dorm room. I said, God, I know you don't want me to do this. I know this isn't the right thing, but I'm going to do it anyway. And how's that for bold, you know? And then I woke up the next morning, and I just did it. And I just went. And I was thinking about this week, and you know what my first thought this week was when I thought about it? I thought, you know what? That didn't really affect me that much. It really wasn't that, like it really didn't create that much many problems. Like I actually was fine. It turned out okay. And then I remembered the person who was hurt because of my decision. And the person who was hurt wasn't me. The person who was hurt is actually somebody I haven't talked to in about 14 years. And immediately I went from feeling, oh, you know what? Like, I took it on my own. I did okay. It worked out fine. To going, oh, I still haven't let that go 15 years later. And I still feel the weight of that decision. Not because of what it did to me, but because I know what it did to somebody else. Now, what's interesting about the Pharisees, we talk about Pharisees, is their pride for how they lived or how they felt like they continued to keep all the rules actually led them to reject the teachings of Jesus in their life. They pushed him away. They rejected his teachings over and over again, except for a few of them who actually began to lean into Jesus' teachings. And one of those who leaned in, one of those Pharisees who leaned into Jesus' teachings is somebody who you're probably familiar with, whether or not you've ever really engaged in conversations about faith or Christianity or church before, right? It's a Pharisee by the name of St. Paul. Many of us are familiar with St. Paul, or at least familiar with the city known as St. Paul, at the very least. Now here's the thing about St. Paul. St. Paul was one of the best rule followers, one of the highest leaders among the Pharisees, one who did everything right and followed all the rules. And yet, after he met Jesus, he actually chose another title for himself, a title that he was certain applied to him, and a title that he was certain applied to you, and a title that he was certain applied to all of us. In fact, I'm convinced that if Paul, for some reason or another, actually showed back up in our world now, about 2,000 years later, and looked around and saw his name on the signs of churches and cities, he would say, whoa, you guys got that wrong. I'm not a saint by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, Paul took another label for himself, a label that you and I resist over and over again. And when he refers to himself, he uses a word that you're not going to like. He uses the S word. He says, I'm a sinner. I'm a sinner. Now let's just talk about this for a second. That just hits a little bit different. Like for me, I read that and I go, ooh, that's like personal. Like it's one thing to say like, oh, I have sin. It's another thing to say I'm a sinner. Like that's a defining word. That's a label. That's a definition that he takes upon himself. And I struggle with that. You probably struggle with that too, right? Like we all have moments where we would just acknowledge, hey, I haven't been perfect. And I've done things that I'm not proud of. We also say things like, but you know what? My past doesn't define me. I'm not the same person today as I was then. And yet Paul, if you read his writings, St. Paul, perfect Paul, if you read his writings, you find over and over again where he tells us over in some way or another, hey, I actually feel like I am the same person today as I was then. And he almost says like, hey, if it weren't for the sake of this power beyond me working on behalf of me, I'd be making the same decisions now as I did then. And then he even goes on to say at times, I still make the same decisions today as I did then, because at my core, he continues to say, I'm a sinner. In fact, in one moment when he's writing a letter to a mentee, someone who looks up to him with admiration and respect, he says in his letter to him, he says, Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the foremost. He goes, hey, I'm not just a sinner, I'm the chief of sinners. I'm the number one sinner. I know you look up to me and you respect me and you admire me, but I'm no saint by any stretch of the imagination. No, I fall far below that. In another letter, he writes these words that I just find fascinating. He says, for I don't understand my own actions. He's like, I can't even make sense of the things that I do. He says, for I do not do what I want. He says, but I do the very things that I hate to do, which quite honestly, you and I understand that quite a bit. I mean, this is just about every New Year's resolution on February 1st, you know? This is every diet on vacation, you know? But how many times do we find ourselves going, I have no idea why I just did that because I know I didn't want to do that, and I knew what the best thing was for me in that moment? This is a lot of us at 10 p.m. in a hard conversation with our spouse. This is a lot of us when we find ourselves forced to choose between getting to that next appointment or pausing to take care of someone in need. This is a lot of us when it comes to giving away generously. This is a lot of us when it comes to making decisions about how we are or aren't going to help our fellow man. We know what we want to do. We know what the right thing is. We know where the bar is, and we want to live above it. But yet at the same time, we find ourselves going, I can't ever quite seem to live up to it, and I don't even understand my own actions. No. If you read the words of Paul long enough, perfect Paul, St. Paul, what you find over and over again is him using language like this to describe himself, continuously recognizing and acknowledging where he lands in relation to the bar, which ought to at least beg us to ask the question, why would such a saint label himself as such a sinner? The answer, quite honestly, is because Paul recognized who Jesus came for. In fact, Paul would have been familiar with a story about Jesus that I think captures the heart of Jesus in a way that ought to give all of us both some level of deep understanding of ourselves and also appreciation for Jesus. It's a story about Jesus when he's calling his first followers, the first people who are going to learn and study under him. Now, typically, a new teacher is going to go and they're going to try to find the best of the best and invite them to follow him. People who have kind of already done some level of study on their own already, people who are respected within the community, is going to invite them to be his first followers, his disciples, his mentees. And Jesus is beginning to build his first team of students, really the people who become the leaders of the movement that he's launching into the world. There's a story within one of the first biographies of Jesus that talks about one of the people who Jesus called to follow him. And the person Jesus called to follow him wasn't the best of the best. They weren't a Pharisee. They weren't a professional rule follower. And they certainly didn't live above the bar. They were nothing other than a tax collector. And Jesus looks at this tax collector who's sitting there collecting taxes and says, come, follow me, learn from me, be a part of my team. Now, everyone looking around would go, why would you choose him? And yet he does. And then he does more than that. He actually goes to his house, goes to the house of the tax collector. And the tax collector has dinner there for him. And the tax collector invites everyone he knows to come and have dinner with him. It's just the problem is that everyone that the tax collector knows lives a life similar to the tax collector, the worst of the worst, the bottom of the bottom. And this author tells us in this moment in Jesus' life, he says that many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples, which is quite honestly unheard of in this time. The fact that a great teacher would share a meal with such lowly people, such discarded people, or such despised and looked down upon people. It doesn't make sense, and yet he does. And when the Pharisees, professional rule followers, the best of the best at living above the bar, when the Pharisees saw this, they said to Jesus' disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? That makes sense. But when Jesus heard it, He said back to those Pharisees, he said, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. He says, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. In other words, I'm more interested in your posture towards the lowest of the low than I am interested in the lowest of the low making up for what they've done. He says, for I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. No. As you continue to study Jesus' life and his teachings, you begin to realize something over and over and over again. And the more you study it, the more you realize it. And it's something, quite honestly, that's foundational to this series. In fact, if we don't start here, the next 4 weeks don't make any sense to us. And just be honest with you, I wrestled all week about whether or not to start here this week. And at the same time, if we don't start here, nothing else falls into place in the rest of our conversations through this series. As you begin to lean in to the teachings of Jesus, as you begin to lean in the life of Jesus and the way that he spent his time, the people who he spent his time with, what you recognize is that to fully appreciate the good news about Jesus, you have to fully acknowledge the bad news about you. For me to fully appreciate the good news about Jesus, I have to fully acknowledge the bad news about me. The bad news about me, the bad news about you, the bad news about all of us, is that we continuously live below the bar. We continuously fall short in moments that we're not proud of. We continue to show up in friendships and not fully be the person that we hope to be for them. We continue to show up in our marriages and not fully be the person who we know we ought to be for them. We continuously show up in moment after moment. And even though we know what we ought to do, even though we aspire to do the best thing and the right thing, we continuously fall short of who we would hope to be. And continuously carry the shame that comes with that. And yet the good news about Jesus is that we're exactly who he came here for. And the more we try to appear like we're above the bar, the more we try to convince ourselves that we are, the less we actually experience the person of Jesus in our world. Now, to be honest with you, for some of us, we've been following Jesus for a while. I've been following Jesus for a while. And I'll tell you what I've seen happen in my life over and over again, and maybe you've seen it happen in your life as well. It's easy after an initial season of following Jesus to actually feel like we're doing a pretty good job. We put into practice a few things. We start to shift a few things in our life. We start to rearrange a few priorities in our world. We start to at least make some strides and take some steps forward. And it's easy in that moment to actually begin to convince ourselves that in some way or another, we're actually living above the bar. We're actually doing everything that we ought to do. And what happens in that moment is we actually begin to experience pride in our lives. A sense of pride that actually keeps us from being able to fully appreciate the good news about Jesus in our own lives day after day after day. Others of us, we find ourselves continuously living in a position, not of pride, but of shame, of guilt. Continuously living in a spot. We're carrying the weight of the things that we've done, maybe even the things that we're currently doing. And we feel like there isn't any place we can sit that weight down. There's nothing we can do with it. It just continues to haunt us over and over. I'll tell you, even this week, as I was preparing for this conversation, I was reminded over and over and over again of things in my own life that I'm not proud of. I'm far from proud of them. Decisions that I wish I could go back for. It wasn't about a week ago, I woke up at 3 a.m. and just remembered something that I completely forgot about from 12 years ago. Where I treated somebody just terribly, I just terribly treated somebody. I was like, man, I still feel the weight of that. But quite honestly, when you lean into the teachings of Jesus and the person of Jesus, what you're going to find is that Jesus doesn't actually desire for you to live from a position of pride. He also doesn't desire for you to live from a position of shame. What he actually invites you to is to live from a position of gratitude in your life. Gratitude that's actually built on who Jesus is and what he has done for you. To which some of us might find ourselves asking, what did Jesus do for me that was actually so good for me? Let's tell you, that's the question that we'll pick up with next Sunday as we continue our series. Let me pray for us before we go. God, I thank you. I thank you for the reminder in my life this week of just who I am, who I've been, and who I will be in the future. God, I thank you for the ways that you have begun undoing areas of pride in me, spaces where I felt like I was doing enough, was enough. God, would you continue to do that work? God, for those of us in the room who have maybe read our own headlines for a while, maybe some of us who have forgotten what our life is like without you, God, would you let today be a day that we're reminded of just who we are in comparison to you and just all the ways that we find ourselves over and over again, actually living in ways that we weren't designed to live, living in ways that we don't aspire to live, living in ways that we would never choose for ourselves. God, for those of us in the room this morning who find ourselves actually carrying the weight of our own decisions, living with shame and guilt for the things that we've done, the ways we've treated others, maybe even the ways we've treated ourselves, God, would you let this series be one in which we find a new place to put that weight, a new place to cast that shame, and that we would discover a position of gratitude as we discover more about you and the ways that you have lived and worked in our world, not just around us, but actually for us and for our behalf. God, we love you. We thank you for this. Would you continue with us in this series? It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.